Emanuel's patched boots carried him deeper into the woods of Paraná, each step a reminder of 15 years lived on society's edges. The setting sun painted long shadows between the trees, and he'd learned to read those shadows. Which ones offered sanctuary, which ones held danger. Meals were sparse, sometimes lunch, sometimes dinner, but rarely both. Each day brought new challenges, and each night carried with it a unique kind of fear and solitude. But it was during one of these nights, out in the deep woods of Paraná, that Emanuel encountered something that would forever change his life. The journey had taken him along a well-worn road in Paraná, his patched boots carrying him forward on autopilot, each step a reminder of the blisters forming beneath his socks, worn threadbare and damp with sweat. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of decaying leaves and moss. The forest felt alive, with rustling leaves and distant hoots of nocturnal animals, giving the night an eerie sense of watchfulness. The scent of guava trees mixed with the smell of damp earth, and the shrill calls of nightjars echoed through the darkening woods. The occasional howl of howler monkeys and the rustling of capybaras moving through the underbrush added to the symphony of the forest. Jacaranda and pau Brazil trees towered above, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. As the shadows lengthened and the day grew dim, night began to settle in like a shroud. His only companion was Jehovah, not a person but a blanket, its fabric worn thin from years of use. He'd named it after reading a torn Bible page about God watching over his people. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sometimes the blanket felt more reliable than any deity. As he moved deeper into the forest, the silence seemed to grow heavier, swallowing up even the faintest sound. It was then that he stumbled upon a clearing with an old, dilapidated house. The house stood like a forgotten relic of another time, its windows gaping like empty eye sockets, the roof sagging in the middle like a broken spine, and the door hung askew on rusted hinges. Paint peeled from the walls in long strips, like skin sloughing off a dead thing. Roof tiles were shattered, and the wood decayed, sending a chill down Emanuel's spine, a stark reminder of how lonely the world could be. But to him, this was shelter. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of mold and rot, the remnants of a forgotten past. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and cobwebs hung like ghostly curtains in the corners. Despite its eerie atmosphere, to Emanuel, it offered a sense of security, a barrier between himself and the elements. He cautiously approached, stepping inside, the remnants of a life once lived scattered around him. Old clothes belonging to a couple and a child, a rusted lantern, a child's homework assignment, half completed, still lay on a dusty table. The pencil marks faded but legible. Minha Familia, written in careful cursive at the top. The clay stove stood like a sentinel in the corner, its surface scarred with the marks of countless meals cooked for a family long gone. He settled near the stove, grateful for the small comfort of four walls, even if they were worn and broken. For 4 nights he rested there undisturbed, but everything changed on the 5th night. After making a short trip to a gas station about 200 meters from the clearing, Emanuel noticed that the forest had gone unnaturally quiet on his return. The silence pressed against his ears like cotton wool, amplifying every crunch of leaves beneath his feet and making the air seem thicker, almost suffocating. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, oppressive silence that pressed against his ears. Once or twice, he thought he saw movement in the shadows, something pale slipping between the trees, but every time he turned, there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The once familiar sounds of the forest had vanished, leaving behind an emptiness that made Emanuel's skin prickle. He felt it, a presence, something or someone following him through the underbrush. The soft crunch of leaves behind him was deliberate, measured, like a predator stalking its prey. Emanuel quickened his pace, his breath coming out in short, anxious bursts, his eyes darting nervously around as he reached the old house. He hurried inside, slamming the door shut behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. He peered into the darkness outside, but it was as if the forest had swallowed everything in a thick, impenetrable veil. Hours passed, and as midnight approached, Emanuel lit a small fire by the stove, its flickering flames casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. The night air grew colder, and a fine drizzle began to fall, adding to the unease that seemed to cling to him. He strained his ears, listening for anything beyond the crackle of the fire. Then he heard it, a distant scream, agonized and chilling, growing nearer with each passing second. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and fear settled deep in his bones. Whatever was approaching was in pain, and the sheer terror of the unknown drove him to act. He scrambled outside, the cold air biting at his skin, and climbed a tall tree to hide. His heart hammered in his chest, every muscle tense, his breath shallow as the screams grew louder, more desperate. Clinging to the branches, Emanuel's hands trembled from both fear and the cold. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, the jacaranda leaves rustling faintly in the breeze as if whispering warnings. The dampness of the air, a harbinger of the wet season, clung to him like an omen of dread. When he finally dared to look down, he saw it. Moving slowly beneath the tree was a massive, white-furred creature. It looked like a dog, but there was something horribly wrong with its form. It limped heavily, its body twisted in unnatural ways, as though it had been deformed by some cruel force. Its movements were a contradiction, powerful yet graceful, bestial yet somehow human. The white fur seemed to capture and hold the moonlight, giving the creature an almost ethereal glow. The creature's fur was matted, and it favored one of its hind legs, clearly injured. Emanuel watched from above, fear gripping his chest like a vice. The creature whimpered, its soft cries in the otherwise silent night as it made its way toward the house. From his perch, Emanuel could see it more clearly as it approached the stove where he had been resting. It gnawed at its wounded leg, and the more he watched, the clearer it became. This was no ordinary dog. Slowly, cautiously, Emanuel climbed down from the tree, each step deliberate, the forest floor crunching softly beneath his boots. The creature tried to stand when it saw him, but its strength had faded. Emanuel's pulse raced, adrenaline coursing through him. Yet there was something in the creature's eyes, a plea, a vulnerability, that drew him forward. He noticed the jagged metal trap clamped around its hind leg, causing the wound. The creature looked at him with eyes that were both canine and hauntingly human, filled with pain, fear, and perhaps hope. Emanuel hesitated, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Memories of stories he'd heard as a child resurfaced, tales of beasts that prowled the night, half man and half beast, filled with rage and sorrow. Could this really be one of those creatures? The white fur, the hauntingly human eyes, everything pointed to the impossible. He didn't dare name it yet. The creature, the embodiment of all his childhood fears, was now in front of him, needing his compassion. Emanuel swallowed hard, his hands shaking, but he knew he couldn't walk away. He grabbed his blanket, approaching slowly, and gently covered the beast, leaving only its injured leg exposed. He then stepped outside to find something that could help free the creature. The cold, damp air stung his face as he searched, his fingers numb until he finally found a sturdy stick, perhaps the handle of an old tool. Returning to the house, Emanuel approached cautiously. The creature let out a low growl, a warning, but its eyes showed no real malice, only fear. For a moment their eyes met, and Emanuel could see something deeper, recognition, almost a plea. The creature seemed to understand that Emanuel meant no harm, and as Emanuel moved closer, the growl subsided into a low rumble, a sign of trust. The creature shifted slightly, allowing Emanuel better access to its wounded leg. Emanuel lowered himself slowly to the creature's level, his hands steadying as he placed them on the wounded leg. Using the stick, he pried open the trap. The creature howled, a sound that shook the very walls of the house, reverberating into the night. Emanuel's heart pounded as he worked, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold, his muscles straining. Finally, the trap sprang open. The creature slumped down, breathing heavily. Emanuel took a piece of cloth from his backpack and wrapped it around the wound. The beast laid its head down, eyes fluttering closed, its body sagging as exhaustion took over. Emanuel moved to the other side of the room, wary but utterly drained. He kept an eye on the creature as the hours ticked by, but eventually exhaustion claimed him. He fell asleep, his back against the wall. When dawn broke, Emanuel awoke to an empty house. The creature was gone, leaving no trace of its presence behind. He stepped outside, his eyes scanning the clearing, but the creature had vanished. Quickly, he gathered his few belongings. He knew he couldn't stay there another night. He made his way to the gas station, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and disbelief. As he continued through the forest, a creeping unease began to settle over him once again. The air seemed to grow colder, the silence pressing in on him like a physical weight. He quickened his pace, his feet crunching against the damp earth, but that feeling, that presence, remained. The trees swayed, their branches creaking as if in discomfort, the underbrush seeming to shrink away from his path. Then he saw it, a pale, gaunt figure emerging from the darkness between the trees. It was skeletal, with elongated limbs and skin so pale it seemed almost translucent. Its hollow, empty eyes locked onto Emanuel, and it let out a rattling hiss as it moved closer, its spindly fingers reaching for him. Emanuel's heart froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew what this was. He had heard of pale crawlers before, creatures that prowled the darkest corners of the wilderness. The creature moved with a jerky, unsettling grace, its long limbs bending in impossible angles. The trees themselves seemed to recoil from the pale crawler's touch, leaves withering where its elongated fingers brushed them, grass beneath its feet turning brown and brittle. The natural world seemed to reject its presence, a stark contrast to the thriving life around them. Emanuel backed away, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, his body trembling. He had no way to defend himself, and the pale crawler was closing in. The eerie silence of the forest seemed to amplify the sound of Emanuel's racing heartbeat. The pale crawler's hollow eyes bore into him, its skeletal form advancing slowly but relentlessly. Every rustle of the creature's limbs seemed to echo in the oppressive quiet, the weight of the silence pressing in on Emanuel's ears. He backed away, his eyes darting around desperately for an escape route, but the darkness seemed to close in from all sides. He could feel the damp earth beneath his boots, the wetness of the approaching rainy season seeping up, and the acrid scent of decaying leaves filling his nose. The pale crawler's fingers, grotesque and impossibly long, seemed to glide through the air, reaching out as if to snatch away any hope Emanuel had left. The growl came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A flash of white fur burst from the underbrush. The werewolf had returned. The albino werewolf lunged from the shadows, placing itself between Emanuel and the pale crawler with a fierce urgency. Its fur bristled, its teeth bared, a fierce snarl rumbling from its chest. The pale crawler paused, its dark eyes locking onto the werewolf. The air grew thick with tension as the two creatures faced off. The pale crawler lunged first, its bony arm slicing through the air. The werewolf reacted instantly, meeting the attack with all its strength. The two creatures clashed, the pale crawler's limbs flailing as it tried to strike, while the werewolf fought back with its powerful jaws and claws. The clearing filled with the sounds of their struggle. The snarls, the growls, the sharp crack of branches breaking underfoot. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of their fury. Grass withered beneath the pale crawler's feet. Leaves shriveled on the jacaranda trees, as if recoiling from its presence. The werewolf moved with a savage grace, its movements fluid despite its own injuries. Emanuel watched, his heart pounding, unable to move. The pale crawler moved with an unsettling speed, its body twisting in impossible ways, but the werewolf was relentless. It sank its teeth into the pale crawler's shoulder, eliciting a bone-chilling shriek. The werewolf shook its head violently, throwing the creature to the ground. The pale crawler scrambled to its feet, its movements frantic, but before it could attack again, the werewolf let out a roar, a sound so powerful that it seemed to reverberate through the very ground. The pale crawler hesitated, its empty gaze locked on the werewolf. Then, with a final hollow hiss, it turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness from which it had come. The werewolf stood there panting, its white fur stained with dirt and blood. It turned to look at Emanuel, its eyes meeting his, and in that moment, Emanuel felt a connection. There was no malice, only understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged between them that night. The werewolf nodded slightly, as if to reassure him, before turning and limping back into the forest, vanishing into the shadows. Emanuel stood there, his body trembling from the adrenaline, his heart still pounding. He knew that the werewolf had saved his life, not once, but twice. He continued his journey to the gas station, his thoughts racing with everything he had seen. As he crossed the yard, one of the attendants called out to him. The man asked if Emanuel had been staying in the old house in the woods. Surprised, Emanuel nodded. The attendant handed him an envelope, explaining that a man, around 45 years old, had come by earlier that morning and asked for it to be delivered to him if possible. Emanuel took the envelope, moved to a quiet spot by the grass and opened it. Inside was a letter and money, thanking him for his help and explaining that the creature he had saved was indeed an albino werewolf, cursed to roam the forest. The letter spoke of a curse passed down through generations, and how, without Emanuel's help, the writer didn't know what might have happened. Emanuel had been given the most valuable gift, a second chance. A chance to leave the streets behind, to reconnect with his children, to build something new from the ashes of his old life. He returned to the city where his children lived, leaving the streets behind for good. The reunion was not without its challenges. His children were wary at first, hesitant to trust the father they had not seen in years. But slowly, through his persistence and sincerity, he won them back. He found work, a modest apartment, and a sense of purpose he had long forgotten. The nights were no longer lonely, filled instead with the sound of his children's laughter and the warmth of their presence. Today, he is with his family, but he will never forget that night. The creature had been wandering, lost and in pain, just as he had been for so many years. In helping the werewolf escape its trap and fighting alongside it against the pale crawler, Emanuel found his own path back to the warmth of a home and the embrace of his children. Emanuel knelt down, his calloused hands gently tracing the faded crayon drawing his daughter had made. It was a stark reminder of how far he had come, from the cold, unforgiving streets and the dark forest to this small but warm home. The simple drawing represented hope, a new beginning that once seemed impossible. It was taped to the fridge, a splash of color in the tiny kitchen of his new apartment. He smiled, the scent of frying onions filling the air, a stark contrast to the damp earth and decay of the forest. He was home. But as he flipped the omelet, a shiver ran down his spine. He could almost hear the pale crawler's hiss, feel the chill of the night air. Sometimes, on full moon nights, Emanuel sees white fur gleaming in the city shadows. He never mentions it to anyone, but he always leaves his window open just in case. After all, some debts can never be fully repaid. They can only be passed forward. Have you encountered something lurking in the darkness? A presence that shattered your understanding of what is possible? DeadNetStudios wants to hear your story of unexpected encounters with the unknown, where fear and humanity intertwine. This story, adapted from Emanuel's account originally shared on the NS Occulto YouTube channel, reminds us that sometimes the greatest terrors lie within, and that acts of compassion can illuminate even the darkest of nights. Send your story to deadnetstudios@gmail.com and help us bring to light the mysteries hidden in the wilderness. The night is long, but every story shared brings us closer to understanding the unknown.
In the shadows of the digital night, we've wandered far and seen some sights, from haunting tales to eerie lights. DeadNetStudios, where fear ignites. So long.